Well, hello, everybody. This is Eliana from AbraTalks here. Hope everybody's fine. I'd like to introduce to Mario Kroll. Mario has been our PR, international PR, media relations this year in 2020. And we are very happy with the job we developed together, what we delivered. And so, as a wrap up of the year, we're wrapping up a bit early. Mario offered himself to give us sort of a best tips or whatever you have to do to make yourself and your game notice when you're doing a global launch. Is that it, Mario? Am I giving a right brief, or should I give the word to you? So here you are. I'm not going to say anything else. Mario Kroll.
No, all good, all good. Yeah, so I in the webinar, I kind of we'll talk about sort of the gamut of video game PR primarily, and I'll talk a little bit about very general topics. So some of you that have experience with PR and PR agencies, that may not be that interesting. We talk a little bit about some tactics and things that you can employ, and then we also talk about whether you should do PR yourself, whether you should hire maybe a freelancer or work with an agency, and if you do that, what that should cost, and also what the pros and cons of those different scenarios are. And then also new for the first time, I've given this talk now a couple times, so this is the very best version of the webinar. And we've added some case studies as well that we'll just talk about a little bit of just some different examples that you might not even realize are PR that we've done, that you can maybe inspire you to give you some ideas of how you can promote a game or service that you're working on using PR techniques. And then I have a little bit of time for Q&A. Eliana, how tight are you guys on time? Is it exactly 1 hour or a little flexible?
It's a little flexible.
Okay, all right. It's Brazil, so I figured you guys are chill and laid back. So yesterday, this presentation took me about a little over an hour, and then we had a little bit of time for Q&A. I chopped some things off, added a couple things, so I'll probably talk for about an hour. And then I was thinking what we could probably do is in the chat channel, which is the little icon in the top right there. I'll just type something. You can type your questions either as they come up or at the end, whatever you prefer. And then Lisa, if you want to turn your video on for just a moment. Lisa is actually, she deserves a majority of the credit. I just own and started the agency. Lisa really has been doing the bulk of the work and made our relationship with Brazil so successful. And this presentation is also a co-collaboration primarily of Lisa and I putting this together. So Lisa will help moderate questions that you have, and she may even answer some questions directly based on sort of her area of expertise. So with that being said, I will go ahead, unless anybody has anything up front.
I just want to ask everybody to turn off your cameras and your microphones, please. So as we have a lot of people hanging on the same call, if you're not talking, please turn off your camera and your microphone, and here you go. Thank you.
No worries. Okay, so I'm gonna add to presenter view, and let's see here. Boom. Oop, all right, skipped ahead. Sorry about that. You didn't see any of that. Okay. So can everybody see my screen right now? Anybody not?
Yeah, it's perfect. It's here.
Perfect. Okay. So we're just going to talk about this. So the topic I named this is, how do we let the world know we made a game? But really it's an overview of video game PR and, what you might want to consider. So a little bit about us. So I am the founder and president of UberStrategist. Before this, I worked in the video game publishing industry for quite a while. And I also worked before that on a popular gaming website. That's actually how I got started as a hobby, that I sold the site in 2004. And then I kind of fell into video game PR, but I also worked in marketing, branding, licensing, and a few other things. And I've been lucky to put together a great team from the US, Canada, and the UK that include game journalists, as well as folks that have experience in PR, as well as community management and influencer outreach. And we started out originally just doing games, and we've now expanded, or I should say just video games, and we have since expanded to also cover other areas of entertainment, such as board games, tabletop games, comic books, and as well as technology, everything from computer hardware to accessories. We also work with a number of nonprofits in the gaming space. Like if you're familiar with Game Jam Plus, we just worked with them and helped them out. And that was actually the first time I gave this presentation. Which is a great cause, and that we actually met through the digital big. So it's all like one big connected thing. Our team together has published or helped publish hundreds of games. We do everything from AAA to indie titles on all major platforms, including platforms that don't really exist anymore. That's how long I've been doing this. And we have also successfully worked with esports clients, with VR, AR, with blockchain, with cloud gaming, and so forth. And the reason I bring that up is because the space is pretty big, and if you have a unique niche to your video game or your product or service, there might be many different ways that you can approach PR and really get an advantage out of it. So let's talk real quick. Just this is an overview of some of the gaming brands and brands that we've worked with. Atari is one of our main clients that we do all of their work for. We work with older retro games, some of the classics like Blood. They are working on a Blade Runner reboot and other things like that. We've worked with wargaming, but we've also worked with a lot of indies. For example, The Veil is a game actually that Lisa discovered and that we've been working with for a while. That is a game for the visually impaired. So it's called the video game, but really it is all about using your ears. And we just found that to be a very compelling game that we were able to get a lot of positive PR for because it had such a unique premise. You know, most people that are visually impaired or even blind cannot really play traditional video games, or they have to have a lot of adaptive technology to do so. And this game actually makes that an advantage, having highly attuned sense of audio. So that's just kind of a little bit of the diversity of things that we've worked on. I do have a trailer here. I'm going to try to play this. I've been warned that potentially with this being a meet, it might be a little bit jittery, so please bear with us. You can always look at this later yourself too. It just kind of is a collage of some of the clients and products that we worked up just to get you fired up for video games in general if you aren't already. And let's see if this... Okay, there we go. Okay, so and that was kind of an overview of some of the games, some of the great games from a wide range of very talented people, and we've just been able to play a small part in their success and to talk to the press and influencers about that. All right, so let's talk a little bit just about what is PR? So PR is about building relationships, developing a cohesive communication strategy. So not just throwing things out there and announcing them haphazardly, but actually having a logical sequence, telling a story, and then engaging with, I made a typo in, engaging with media and influencers to enhance the perception of an organization, its members, and its products or services. So the main point here is it's not advertising, it's not marketing. That is something that you typically pay money to and create, and it's a direct message from you to the consumer. With PR or publicity, what you do is you use an in-between, be it press or be it influencers or content creators, to get them to talk about your brand. So it's part of the marketing mix. You still want to do marketing and advertising, but PR is sort of that third leg of that three-legged chair, if you will. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what PR is not. So it's not user acquisition or sales. It is not advertising or marketing, although what I said was it is part of the marketing mix, and all of those should be considered. It's not community management, but that is also very important. And actually, I would say community management and PR need to walk sort of connected at the hip because their messaging has to support each other. You don't want to talk in community, for example, like through social media or your forums or on your Discord server. You don't want to release details about a game that haven't been publicly announced yet, if at the same time you're trying to get a press release out or some other big story with a magazine about that same feature. So you just need to be aware that they support each other and can sabotage each other. It is also not, a lot of people think that, well, PR kind of, in American slang is called spin doctoring. But, that it's a little bit of a misnomer, because PR does not give you permission to act badly or to fix mistakes when you're being untruthful. It's not about lying. It's simply about having an open and genuine conversation and perhaps focusing on the positive aspects rather than the negatives. We personally think it might be magic. Some people don't, but it has some traces of it sometimes when it's working great. All right, why is PR important? So with PR, you can help potential customers learn about your product and whether it is a fit for them. That's with previews, with reviews, with other coverage. You can get feedback from your community as well as from third parties. And I put objective in quotes because I'm talking about the press, and this is not at all a dig on the press, but video game reviews, video game coverage is a subjective discipline, which means everybody has their own opinions. So when you read a review and one outlet hates your game and another one loves it, which is the truth? Well, it really depends on who the person is and what they prefer and so forth. However, if you get the same feedback from a number of different sources, there's probably something to it, and you should consider listening to that. And one important point there is, if you're doing this during a preview cycle, which happens before review, you're not getting scores yet, but it's like the first opportunity for the press to sort of test drive your game on their own, and they're going to write about it. And if you get a lot of feedback about something maybe that's not ideal or something that could be improved in your game, you should listen, because if you don't fix that and then you release the game and it has that same problem, you will get penalized in a lower review score. So it's a great source for you to get feedback through PR. And it can also help to minimize the negative impact of messaging mistakes or poor communication or another crisis event. Basically, it is very easy to make something worse by saying the wrong thing. And that's why a lot of times you'll see articles and say, well, that person or outlet or company was not available for comment immediately, because they're thinking a lot of times it's better to say nothing than to say the wrong thing. And I do agree with that. But if you have a skilled PR person, they can help you minimize whatever negative thing happens. With that being said, as Warren Buffett said, it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. I would say that statement was probably written before social media, because nowadays it takes about 5 seconds to ruin a good reputation. The best thing, of course, is to avoid doing that at all. PR can also help attract publishers. We've worked with a number of indie developers that got some great coverage very early on. In fact, we've been hired by a few specifically just to get buzz when a game was first announced or first playable. And publishers do like to see some coverage out there. Now, you do need to be careful if you're, for example, courting, the really big publishers. And if you already have their attention, it is best not to do anything until you either have a deal signed or they've given you some instructions, because you definitely don't want to screw something up and maybe announce a game that they would rather keep under wraps until they're ready to do something. So you have to be a little careful there. But if you're an indie and you don't want to self-publish and you're looking for a publisher, getting some great initial press coverage out there is a great way to get the attention of publishers. And it's also something you can send to publisher when you're pitching and say, hey, look, PC Gamer or IGN said some really great things about the game that we're working on from an early look. Can we have a conversation? You can attract potential partners, and that's a wide range: investors, technology partners, and so forth. Talked about investors. Talent, this is an important one. If you're, especially if you're a new studio or maybe a smaller or lesser known studio, and you're trying to attract some top tier developers, producers, whatever, they might be more likely to come work for you, perhaps even for a lower rate, if you're working on something that the media is already excited about. So, don't underestimate that for a recruitment tool as well. And then very important also, when you're attending trade shows and events, you should put probably as much effort into your pre-event PR to make sure you have appointments and good turnout of both press and influencers as you are spending, because we all know trade shows are pretty expensive. And if you don't, pre-seed appointments, you could end up standing in your booth either very bored or with only consumers. And I'm not taking anything away from consumers, but they're going to limit in how much they're going to spread the word about your game. If you can get a big editor come in your booth, it could make all the difference to the success of your game, especially early on. All right. Just want to do a quick check-in. Is the pacing okay right now? Am I talking too fast, too slow? We're good?
For me, it's okay. For everybody else, is okay? Yes.
All right. I will continue. All right. You should consider using PR to initially announce a product. That's when you first make that decision. You want to, make the world aware that you're working on this. You should also consider it when you're launching a new product, including early access as an option. Whenever you have a significant update to an existing product, for example, if you are in early access and you have a new key milestone, that's a great place to use PR. Or even after you've launched a game and you have a new DLC or new content, those are all great things to talk to the press about. When you want to talk about partnerships, if you're working on, a well-known publisher's game or IP, or you've brought somebody in to bolster your studio, or you're partnering with an esports company or an accessory or a PC gaming company, those are all opportunities where you can use PR to talk to the press. Already talked about visibility ahead of trade shows or events to really boost your ROI. And also sometimes to announce key hires. If you make a strategic acquisition or a hire, a new chief marketing officer that's worked on some big games, that could actually really help bolster your studio and make it appear much more seasoned and experienced, because in their own right, individual team members have done some pretty amazing things, and now you're sort of building a super band. At least that's sort of how I would position that as a PR professional. And you can also make key financial announcements. If you have a seed round or somebody invests in you significantly, those are all interesting things just to get the word out about your studio. When should you start planning PR? really as early as you possibly can. Maybe not when you first conceive a game, but before you show the game really to anybody else, you should at least be thinking about PR. You'll be surprised, I think, how many times I've been approached or I've seen at a trade show a game that looked really, really good. I'd never heard of it anywhere. Not that I am the audience for every game and know about every single game out there, but I do try to keep my ear to the ground. And I'll ask them. I said, "What did you do for PR on this game?" And I said, "Well, we didn't really think about PR until we were pretty much ready to launch the game, and we didn't really know what to do, so we didn't do much at that point. Or we tried to do our own PR for the last couple months. We'd never really done it before." At that point, there's very little that can be done, and I just you can just chalk it up to a very valuable and sometimes very expensive lesson. So think about your PR and your marketing effort almost while you're still in early days of developing your game. Doesn't mean you have to start your PR, but you need to start planning for it. Okay, so now what I want to do is walk you through, we call this a sample indie PR timeline. This is just one example of roughly about 6 months. It can also apply to AAA titles, and it's not a hard and fast rule, but just gives you kind of an idea of pacing of how we might craft a PR timeline for a game that we're working on when we know we have about 6 months to launch the game. Of course, a good PR partner will work with you individually and come up with a timeline collaboratively with you based on what assets you have, what kind of game it is, what kind of trade shows are out there and when they're happening, and lots of factors go into this. But hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea if you've never come up or worked with a PR timeline. It's also good to know when you're working with a publisher to sort of sanity check, are they doing enough? Why are they not maybe doing certain things? And sometimes you just asking some direct questions, are you doing this or that? And hearing what they answer will give you an idea as to whether this particular publisher is going to do a good job for your PR. All right, so ahead of the PR campaign, this is like a Kickstarter, crowdfunding, same kind of thing. Preparation is everything. The more stuff you can do up front, the less you have to do during the heat of the battle. Think about what sets your game apart. Get your messaging really down. If you can't describe your game in maybe 30 seconds, or I'd say no more than 2 minutes in a really compelling way, then your messaging is not quite there yet. And I would practice and rehearse that. I would, a good example for me a lot of times is, if I can describe a game to my mom and she understands it, then I've done a pretty good job. So just don't make assumptions. Make sure you can explain what your game is about to a diverse range of people that might be gamers and non-gamers. And once you have that, and if they resonate and get excited about it, you have a pretty good clue that you've done a good job. Establish some key milestones. Everybody thinks about development milestones when they're making develop. And I'm sorry, I'm assuming that a big portion of this audience are developers and professionals around the development. If that's not the case, then that obviously may not apply to you as much. But you should also be thinking about your PR outreach, because one of the things that often happens is, especially with inexperienced developers and even publishers sometimes, is they don't think about the assets that they need for PR and marketing outreach. And usually the same people are creating, trailers, screenshots, and things like that that are also making the game. And so if you haven't allocated some time or bandwidth and you're in crunch time, you're trying to get the game done, you need exactly 6 weeks to ship it. And now suddenly you have to think about, you need 2 weeks to create PR assets or marketing assets. Who's going to do that? Are you going to delay the game? So it's best to think about that early on. Make sure you have visual assets to support each of the outreaches that you plan. Develop and write up a game fact sheet. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. Create a company boilerplate. That's usually one paragraph at the bottom of press releases that says what your studio is all about. It can incorporate, where you're from, when you're founded, what the founders have done, if there's a common thread amongst games that you're making, like if there's something that's your mission statement or your passion or makes you stand out, that's all good stuff to put into your company boilerplate. And then make sure you start thinking about an initial press kit. We'll talk about press kits a little bit more. Create your community and your social media channels. You can't just turn on the faucet and build a community overnight or to get a social media channel up to size. So it's important to start working on building your fan base early on. And along with this, by the way, when I say community, you should also recommend a Discord server to start building a community there. It's a great tool for that as well. Start to develop a social media and community calendars tied to PR messaging. Start thinking about what you're going to write on your social media channels and what you're going to share with your community. And then also start thinking about what are the key outlets that are going to matter to your game. For example, if you're a PC-only title, something like PC Gamer might be really important. You know, if you have a software as a service solution, you might want to talk to somebody that talks about the business of games, you know, like VentureBeat or so forth. You know, if you're a developer or you're making developer tools, you might want to talk with, you know, outlets like Develop or Gamasutra or others that are going to talk a little bit more about the technology behind gaming and so forth. So just think about where would you like stories about you to be featured to make a big difference to you and your stakeholders. Okay, so as we get about 3 to 6 months prior to launch, we want to announce the game, the release date, ideally with a trailer and a press kit. You could consider pitching an exclusive or breaking news, maybe a great interview with one key outlet. And that can sometimes give you a great head start on then getting publisher interest and other things. We recommend at this point that you're planning to release something new every single month. You want to keep the game fresh in the mind of editors. You're still introducing it, but you don't need to overdo it yet. But you don't want to go more than at least once a month with something new, a trailer, screenshots, other things. Consider, if your game is ready, to invite media to get a first look preview of a beta build. Again, you know, it's better to show something short, like a vertical slice that's really good, than to show the full game and have it broken in a bunch of places. So think about, it's very important that you manage that well, because you're in control. You want to put your game in the very best light. Use your social media to share any positive coverage that you get, as well as any accomplishments or milestones. Continue to add contacts to your press list. That's an ongoing process, and we'll talk about how to build a press list in just a minute. And then as we get 2 to 3 months out, we're basically doing the same thing. We're just picking up the pace a little bit. So now, every couple of weeks, you want to consider sending something out about your game, typically in conjunction with assets. Consider previews, and these are unscored reviews. I talked about that a little bit earlier as a feedback source. You want to be careful. And the reason we recommend doing it 2 to 3 months out, if you wait any later, you're too close to release. And a lot of the big outlets will say, especially if they're busy, like they're in fourth quarter right now, you know what, we will just wait until the game releases in a month, then it'll be complete and we can just do one piece of coverage. So you're actually sort of stealing one piece of coverage from yourself with that outlet. If they can do, you know, an initial release, then a preview, and then 2 months later a review, you've gotten 3 different pieces of coverage from the same outlet. And so that sort of should be your strategy. You should also consider inviting influencers, perhaps for limited pre-release Let's Play opportunities. And one caveat that I want to put out for this, you know, this depends on the type of game that you have. If you have a linear adventure game, for example, that is only 6 hours of gameplay, but once and streamers will play games all the way through in one session. So, you know, imagine a game that's a puzzle game and it's 5 or 6 hours of play and they play it all the way through. Well, at this point, the game has sort of been spoilered. You know, if it's something that's a platformer that you can do speed runs and different things, it's less of an issue. But if you have a linear game, I would not recommend having streamers play the whole game. You might want to either you can say, hey, look, we'll let you play the first 30 minutes, or only give them one chapter of your game or something like that, where you're still letting them have a sizable amount of gameplay, but you're not spoilering your own game too early or doing it through influencers. Okay. Continue to add relevant contacts to your press list. Amplify any trade show participation. That includes, right now in the age of COVID, virtual trade shows. Plenty of those going on. Probably even more important, you've got to cut through and make sure that editors will go check you out at a trade show if you're putting all the effort of being there. And I would say to that, don't rely just on the trade shows to drive press in. Like, do your own work to make sure it's great. If the trade show will bring in press, that's great, but that doesn't mean the press will come check you out at that trade show. So always make sure you take ownership of that task yourself and ensure you have press appointments for you. And then again, amplify positive coverage, milestones, and assets through your social media and your community. And then month of launch, that's as we call it, Hell Week. You know, this is kind of where all that preparation will pay off. And if not, this is where you pay the price. We usually do a coming soon announcement. We now invite the press to review the game, which means typically we send out digital keys. Sometimes you can send out physical goods, like little gift kits and unboxing kits and stuff. It really depends on what your product is, what your budget is, and all of that stuff. You can pitch feature stories based on the game, the team, or something related to the game. On the day of launch, we usually do a press release that announces the game is available now. And then a lot of PR is literally just following up and making sure the people that got keys are actually going to do coverage and so forth. And again, amplify everything positive that you're doing. These are your social media channels. You don't need to pick the neutral or the negative thing. You can really just brag about your positive stuff. And then, you know, a tip I would use, there's something called an embargo date. If you're not familiar with that, it basically is you reaching out to the press and you just say, hey, this is under embargo. And that lets them know, don't talk about this until we agree. And so it's an opportunity for you to reach out, maybe give a game key a week or two before the game launches to an editor. And then you can say, but the game is embargoed until the day of launch. And what that does, it allows editors, they can do it later, but they can't publish a review any earlier than the date and time you set. And what that does then is it kind of compresses, if you do a week or two early, they have enough time to do reviews, and then all the reviews, or the majority of them, will publish at one time on the same date. And for example, if you're on Steam, Steam typically, unless you have an existing relationship, will not give you a lot of marketing support up front. However, if a game does well on Steam, they will typically double down and help promote it and highlight you in the top performing lists and so forth. So if you get lots of good reviews all coming out in the same day, assumably, usually that will drive traffic toward launch day, and that may then just get you some additional exposure and promotion. The other thing about why to do an embargo is if you have a bunch of positive reviews, let's assume it's all good news, coming out before the game is available, sure, they can go and, you know, put you on a wish list or maybe even pre-order the game, but it is more compelling to allow people to see a great review and immediately buy the game and download it and play it that day instead of having to wait until it launches. So I'm a big fan of that, but, you know, there's not necessarily a right and wrong way to do this. And then, you know, after launch, you're not quite done. There's still things you can do. You can do a post-launch accolades trailer. You've seen these. This is basically where it can be your launch trailer all over again, but maybe you're pulling in short quotes from different outlets and consumers and fans and influencers that say nice thing about your game. Usually it's good to have nice short quotes and get people excited about all the great things that other third parties said about your game. You can continue to invite press to review your game for a little while. I would say no more than probably a week or two after release. Then it'll be old news, and then you probably won't get any coverage for your keys. You definitely can continue to invite influencers to create video content because they keep stuff fresh for a while. They may even revisit older games if, you know, they like a certain genre. And then again, follow up, reach out to the rest of the people that got keys, keep track of them and follow up and say, hey, we haven't seen your review yet. Maybe we missed it. Could you send us the link? Be polite, don't be pushy. They get busy. Some people, you know, you're not going to get everybody that gets a code to review. It is a long-term relationship you're trying to build. So, you know, and some people are just going to blow you off. It's unfortunate, but you can track those people, and maybe next time when they ask for a key, you don't give them a key for a review. You can also sometimes, after launch, if it's relevant, either announce significant new game additions. So if you have an MMO or an online game and there's new content coming out, or you're coming out with a DLC, or potentially you launched PC first and then 3 months later you're also doing a Switch version. That's all stuff that you can announce after your initial game launch, and typically also parlay some of your successes with your first release toward your second one, assuming that the game reviewed well. If it didn't review well, then maybe you don't mention the first release so much and you really focus almost like it's a new game that you're pushing out there. Okay, and so I talked about platforms. All right, let's talk a little bit about how to reach the press. All right, I want to talk a little bit about just techniques, just so you're familiar with the language. So a pitch is basically a short message or sometimes a phone call to the press where, it's a paragraph or two, no more than 3 paragraphs, kind of like a cover letter for a CV or a resume, where you're asking for specific action. You could, for example, ask, if they want to have an interview with somebody from your studio, or if they would like an exclusive or break, or get first dibs on a new trailer. If you're having an event, you could ask them to come to the event. It's just a teaser to establish a conversation. If they respond, they'll typically ask you for more information. So that's why I say here, pitches are often paired with a press release or media alert. I don't usually send both together. I do the pitch and then I wait. And then when I get a response, a lot of times the editors say, well, let me see the video or let me see the press release. I'll honor your embargo. That's very important. Then you can send them that other information. They review it and say, okay, cool, this is enough of a story. Sometimes they'll come back and say, hey, after reading this, it's not enough for me right now, maybe later. And then you move on. And a media alert is fairly common used. It's a less formal and shorter outreach than a press release. It can be used. It's normally not picked up verbatim, and you can be a little more creative. For example, we've done media alerts, to announce trailers, new screenshots. Sometimes we'll use it to follow up when we want to see if somebody wants to review a game. We've also done some creative media alerts where, for example, we were working on a game where the main character had been subjected to torture and so was very paranoid, or was he? But a little psychotic. So we actually wrote a letter in the voice of the main protagonist of the game to editors full with typos and scribble outs and telling them please don't let anybody know because they're being watched, and it was very, very successful. So don't be afraid of having fun, because you do, as long as you're staying within character to your studio and your game, because the whole point of messaging and PR is for you to cut through all the noise, all the boring press releases that they get hundreds a day. If you put some effort into it and make it stand out, you'll get much better results and much better responses. All right, and then there is the press release, sort of the daddy of all formal communication. It's typically 1 to 2 pages. It follows a standard format. For example, publicly traded companies will always use press releases. You have to remember that press releases sometimes get copied verbatim and just distributed, so you're not getting a real editorial piece, but it goes really wide. And that also means that's another reason why you want to be particularly careful about grammar and style, because they're going to just take what you have. And you also want to pay attention to make sure that you have really good quotes in a press release, because those quotes are probably the most commonly quoted material that gets put into other articles. So you want to make sure that quote identifies who the person is, says something meaningful, and also includes your brand and your company. And there's a whole science to writing quotes, but don't leave those out of press releases. And then, a side note, we also have something called an AP wire distribution. I don't actually know I guess it is global. It's pretty prevalent in the US, but basically it's a network called the Associated Press. It's about 15 to 16,000 national, regional, and local, primarily newspaper It comes from the old Wild West, where basically, people literally would put the news on the wire, like you see in some of the movies. And it's a network of all of these outlets, and they will usually just pick up the story and transfer it verbatim. Publicly traded companies like Atari will put everything on the wire. It is good for specific news if you've got like a big financial announcement or a big partnership or something you really want to get out there for SEO and keyword pickup and stuff. I do recommend sometimes an AP wire is a good thing to do, but I would never rely on any kind of distribution service as your only form of PR. Most of that just doesn't work. You need to do the work. Okay. Pitches, just to recap real quick, pitches can be used when you want to share news under embargo, when you want to secure an exclusive, or what we call breaking news. Breaking news is basically you get to write about something maybe an hour before everybody else. We still send it to everybody else. They just, have to delay a little bit. And outlets like that because their livelihood depends on being first. That's why it's called the news. They want to be the newest. So, if you strike a good deal with a big outlet, they will put a little more effort into promoting that, and it also secures you at least one win, and then other outlets will pick it up later. You can also invite the media or influencers to check out your game. You can offer an interview or a feature story, and it's also good to do a save the date. For example, if you're going to press tour, for example, a lot of times we'll say, hey, we're thinking about coming to town. For example, a good example is right when COVID was starting to happen in February, we were thinking about doing a press tour. It wasn't yet clear if everything was going to be shut down. We weren't sure if we wanted to travel. We thought about it, and it really depended on would we be able to get anybody to come to a meeting if we went all the way, let's say, to San Francisco for meetings. And so I reached out with a pitch to maybe 10 different editors that I know in San Francisco and said, hey guys, we're thinking about doing this. We're going to take all the precautions. We're going to be in a hotel suite, just one-on-one, doing social distancing. Would you come to check out this game? And that gave us then some feedback to say, do we do it? That we could talk about with the client and say, hey, it's not worth it. Nobody's going to show up. We don't need to book hotels and flights and take the risk and so forth. So you can use it in some very helpful ways. A media alert is sort of in the middle between a pitch and a press release, used very often to announce new game features, show off existing gameplay, announce minor milestones. If you're about to release a date, you've already announced the game, now you're going to say, hey, it's around the corner. We use it for that. Again, sometimes it can be used to invite press to an event. So usually what I'll do with an event is do a save the date, like a short pitch, and say, on this date, we're going to have kind of a big deal. You're not going to want to miss it. Mark your calendar, but I don't say much else. And then I'll follow up with a media alert to say, this is who, what, where, when, why, here's how you RSVP for it. And I just build on that. Again, it's about layering the story. Often it's used to announce new trailer or assets. And sometimes, again, you can also use it to announce a game on a new platform. It just depends on the magnitude of news. And there's not a right or wrong way. Like nobody's going to freak out because you used a media alert when you should have used a press release. They're kind of interchangeable. Press releases definitely should be used, though, when you unveil a game, because that's big news. When you announce a release date, sometimes you'll see there's some overlap between the two. When you launch a game the day of, that's really important. Or maybe when you go to a new key territory, new country, when you want to announce a major partnership, major financial news. If you're a publicly traded company, you probably are required to use press releases for all major announcement. And then, you can do it. You can also, in some cases, when you announce a key new hire, that sometimes is also appropriate for, depending how big the hire is and how well they're known, that can be appropriate for a press release as well. Let's talk briefly just in generalities. I'm just going to fill this in. Lisa, remind me to make this all show up at once, please, next time. So these are just the gamut from the most accessible, least sophisticated to the most sophisticated, and there's lots of other variants just to give you an idea. So you can do PR outreach with just Gmail or your Outlook or whatever. It looks like it's a personal email. That gets the highest response rate consistently, but it's very labor intensive. Please, the one thing, if you don't remember anything about this webinar, if you're going to do your own PR and your own pitching, never ever put your press list on CC. If you've ever been in any kind of distribution distribution groups like that, it will happen. Somebody typically new to PR will take a trade show press list or of press, put them all in the CC, and then the endless reply alls will happen and everybody gets spammed. People get pissed off. It's just a bad scene. Don't be that person. You'll be shunned for life by the press. I probably exaggerate, but it's a bad thing to do. If you need to do that, put them on blind copy, but it is still better if you're going to send individual emails just to be safe. Just do one email at a time and carefully pick your contacts. In the middle of that, we have a tool called Mailshake. It's just sort of more a mass mailer. You can upload your spreadsheet, you format everything, and then you can do some personalization. You can, put their name in it, their outlet if you want, so it still looks like a personal email that you sent to them. It still looks like a normal email. It can sometimes end up in promotional mail or even spam, but not as much as with the next solution. And you are limited to how many links and assets you can put in there and so forth. So it looks like sort of a plain email. Sometimes a plain 2 or 3 paragraph email honestly gets the best responses. And then the last thing, there's MailChimp, there's Aweber, Constant Contact. Yesterday I couldn't think of any of these. But basically, there's lots of tools like that. They usually have a database built in, which gives you really valuable information, like who's opened your emails, how often do they typically open them, what kind of emails are they opening. You can segment your list and keep data about them, where they're from, what platforms they cover, all kinds of things like that. We use MailChimp right now as sort of our bread and butter for sending out emails. You can do automated scheduled follow-up, so it's quite powerful. Again, the downside, it's less powerful. Less personal. It can get, put in the promotional email folder with like Gmail and things like that. But on the upside, you can make your press releases stand out more. You can put, little glowing buttons because frankly, editors a lot of times don't read emails that you send to them, so having a big button that says, click here to get your key may still get missed, but you have the capability of doing that with a tool like MailChimp. So you'll have to individually sort of decide what works for you. Generally, the more outreach you do consistently, I would recommend something along the lines of MailChimp rather than just using individual emails. Okay. Talk briefly about how to find press contacts. One of the first thing is to think about what press do you really want to reach. So you will make it a game, so you want to reach the games media, obvious, right? But what platform? Not all platforms. If you're making a game for PC or Xbox and not covering Switch, Nintendo Life is not going to cover you. So why waste and irritate that editor with that outreach? On the same token, if this is a PC only and a kind of a big deal, PC Gamer is a perfect outlet. You definitely want them on there. Genre specific. They are, if you're doing, 2D point and click adventures or platformers, there are outlets out there that specifically, MMOs is another one, that specifically cater to certain types of games. Be aware whether the outlets cover what you are selling them, and do a little bit of homework, because editors like nothing less than getting pitched something that they would never ever possibly cover and that you reasonably should have known, and you're just being lazy to not filter them out. Territory, if the game is not available in a certain country, why bother reaching out to editors there? There's not much for them to do. If you have key territories, for example, if you think your game will do well in, all over Europe, you might also want to consider, do you just want to send this out in English, or do you want to localize your press release? Most of our clients, we do our PR in English because we're based in the US. And frankly, most of the gaming media particularly is used to receiving press outreach in English and doesn't worry too much about localization. But we do notice that you get a better pickup in some territories if you do have localized versions as well. For example, we have one client that does regularly localized, and then we just send the other versions out as well. And that does help. So you'll have to decide, is it worth the additional effort? I would say English only, you probably get maybe 80% of the press, but probably 90 to 95% the press that really has influence. Whereas if you do a localized one, you can probably get closer to getting 95% pickup and broader distribution, especially probably with smaller and mid-sized outlets in some countries. Is there a technology angle? Is yours a VR game, an AR game? Is there an esports angle? Look at those outlets. Mainstream newspapers, Washington Post has its own gaming vertical. USA Today has its own gaming vertical. And even within gaming, Polygon not only does core gaming, they also have a whole vertical for pen and paper tabletop games. So just be aware and do some research and make sure they're going to cover, what you're pitching. And along with that, also think about, who is the editor? Just because you hit somebody up at IGN does not mean that they're the right fit for you. For example, you're pitching a new release that you're first announcing. That's a news item. So you want to talk to a news editor. You don't want to bother the review editor. The review editor is not going to look at your game until it's actually reviewable. So, why not, wait until that's ready to go? So I know there's a lot of stuff I'm throwing at you. I've been doing this for a long time, but it's really just logic. Think about, if you're trying to build a list of friends or peers or any other network that you want to reach out to, let's say you're pitching a game to a publisher, and it's on a certain platform, don't pitch a mobile gaming platform if you don't have a mobile game. And this is exactly the same thing. All right, lifestyle entertainment. Maybe there's an angle for you. For example, we've had tie-ins with movies. That game I was talking about earlier for the visually impaired, it actually got picked up by the Hollywood Reporter as an exclusive, as the first breaking story. And, we just sort of got lucky with that, but it was different enough for them to be excited about the story. So don't forget about non-gaming outlets that only sometimes cover gaming as well. Financial, business focused. Obviously, if there's an angle there, like VentureBeat is a great one, especially if you're a new studio and it's a first ambitious project. They're usually very good about covering some big initial announcement. Technology outlet, Engadget, Wired, some of them cover, crossover stuff. And then think about, is there something unique about your game that fits, a need? For example, music. We did a game with Atari not too long ago that featured Avicii, arguably the best, the largest, best known, most famous EDM musician. And we were able to partner with, not only did we get great coverage from the gaming outlets because it was a rhythm music game, but because Avicii was involved in the game and was the subject of the game and his music was involved, we also were able to get some great interviews with, for example, EDM.com, which is, one of the biggest EDM and house music outlets. That would not be a fit for everything. So, for military games, there's, Stars and Stripes and all kind of Wargamer, there's military focused outlets out there that will be a fit for certain things. So it's always better to do, maybe less outreach, but very targeted than to just go shotgun and scatter it to everybody. All right, where to look for, oops, I do this every time with the, there must be a bad link in here, Lisa, by the way. Okay. So outlet contact or about us pages, if you go to IGN.com, for example, they will usually list their staff, their editors, who there is. They may have email contacts. Some outlets may just have a, news at outlet name or whatever, but, it's a great place to get started. Social media, we look up editors all the time on Twitter, LinkedIn, and so forth, about me, portfolio websites and things like that. Hunter.io used to be better. It's still a rudimentary tool. For example, you could type in WSJ for Wall Street Journal, and it will pull down a number of addresses that it says are editors at Wall Street Journal. You should still verify those and make sure those people are really there. For a paid version, you get a little bit more, but it gets you started. Muckrack is a paid service where pretty much all journalists have a profile, so it's a great resource to finding editors. Meltwater is a tool that we use in-house that also does coverage tracking and reporting. It's reasonably expensive, a few $1,000 $100 a year, but it allows us not only to find editors and also to track coverage globally. It also allows us to see where the coverage is coming from. It allows us to see what the sentiment is, for example. So as you're getting more serious about PR, this is a good tool to have as well. And again, it costs you money, but it's, you know, it's well worth it. And then you can also, and you should, if you're attending an event or trade show, you should request an official press list from events. This is actually one of the most interesting experiences you'll probably ever have, because most events get very excited, tell you about all this press that will be at the event, and then you go and get the press list and there's like 15 people on it and half of them aren't even press. So prepare yourself, that will happen. This is a steady, long and steady race. You're just always looking for an increasing number of high quality press contacts that you can build a relationship with and that you build on. Also keep in mind, you know, connect with these people on social media and track it, because, you know, the games industry especially, outlets are laying off, shutting down, getting sold. So this changes every couple of months. So, you know, staying on top of that can become a bit of a full-time job, but if you do it right, it will pay for itself. And then the other thing very important is to talk about, you know, I don't know what privacy requirements are, for example, for Latin America or Brazil particularly as much, but for example, with GDPR, the EU regulation, there is a little bit of a debate out there because a lot of editors have their information publicly posted on websites, and so you should be able to reach out to them. If in doubt, it is always best when you're building a database of press contacts that you simply invite them like to a sign-up form and let them sign up, and make sure that you have an opt-in agreement, like a checklist, checkbox, like MailChimp will do this for you automatically, where they just say, I consent to letting you reach out to me about, you know, your press clients or your games or whatever the case is. Better safe than sorry. You don't want to get sued because you're sending an email to somebody and they claim that it's spam or whatever else. Okay. All right, press kits, I will talk quickly through this. So here's just a sample, very bare bones. There is a website called Press Kit that is a public domain that was made by a prolific developer. It's a really cool tool. They have a lot of samples there. If you're first starting out, it's actually a great place to see what goes in a press kit as well as host your own. And a lot of indies already do this. But we recommend that you definitely include company and game logos. Make it as easy for the editors as possible to just use those. I recommend print resolution or higher. That's about 300 DPI or better. They can always down-res it for the web. Key art, you know, make sure you have 4 to 6 good high-resolution images, and think about all the possible uses that editors might want to do it. You know, if it's a print magazine, or, you know, putting it in social media, or if it's online, they might want different types of art in different sizes and specs. The more of that work you do for them up front, the more likely it is that they'll just use it, because editors are super busy, and, you know, if this is a shortcut because you've already done all the work for them, it just makes it easier to cover you. Screenshots, you know, don't put watermarks on them. Press doesn't like that. Show a variety of screenshots and take this serious. This is like, you know, a professional photographer taking photos. Like, take 50 screenshots and then pick the 3 or 4 or 5 that are the best ones. Get rid of everything else. This is you selling the game. Don't ruin it on sending a screenshot that's kind of so-so. Okay, and then trailers, we recommend, you know, a minimum an announcement trailer, a release trailer, and also a launch trailer. And we recommend these are anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes in length. You know, if you've never done a trailer before, you don't know where to get started, sometimes your, you know, publisher or your PR agency can help you with that a little bit. My recommendation is, you know, look at trailers in gaming that you like and start by mimicking until you find your own voice. You can kind of see what the big studios are putting out there, the successful games, what information are they conveying, what's their pacing, and start there. That you can't go wrong with that. Okay, additional assets that you don't have to include, but we do recommend, that's why we call them bonus assets. So having animated GIFs, These are underrated. We include them in our press releases and media alerts sometimes. They're easy to make. It gives you a quick 3-second or so animation. It gives streamers and content creators a quick view for what the gameplay might be like without having to click on and open a trailer. It gives editors an idea whether visually the game looks good, and that gets you a long way there. So don't ignore animated GIFs. Don't overdo it, but consider using them. Additional trailers, if you're going to create them for additional PR outreach, developer diaries are great, longer gameplay videos. If you have specific gameplay features or game elements that you can highlight, that's great to do that as well. And sometimes it's easier to shoot a bunch of this footage up front and then slice it up into edited videos later. We also recommend B-roll, and that's basically 5 to 20 minutes of gameplay of footage. It can be different members of your team, the area where you're living or where your studio is, gameplay, uninterrupted gameplay of the game, showing kind of, interface, the startup and everything else. This is not meant for the press to take it verbatim. This is for them to edit it out, and you've probably seen this like at trade shows when they do an interview with you or something. While you're talking, they might want to play some footage in the background, and so this is what journalists use to create some of that background footage. And just remember that a few great assets are much better than tons of just mediocre assets. Less is more in this case. Okay, what else should you include? We also recommend that you always put a fact sheet in your press kit. That should just be a 1-page typically, with key art, your company, the premise of your game, key features, the supported platforms, the release date if you've announced it, and don't forget your contact information. Same thing with press releases and media alerts. Always make sure you put your contact information on it. It's amazing how many times that gets left off, okay? Let's talk just a minute about how much should PR cost. So Bill Gates obviously feels very favorably toward PR. So I would say priceless, but things to consider and why you might be getting different prices depending what your project is or who you're talking to, is how long of a PR campaign is optimal for what you're trying to promote. What territories matter to you? If you're, for example, working on just North America, it's, a little bit easier to execute than if you're trying to do global PR. It's just less work, from everything from outreach to tracking to reporting. There could be other agencies involved. So if you have 3 agencies involved, that's great. You have to pay 3 agencies then, and you typically want to either you yourself will have to manage 3 agencies, or one of the agencies needs to be a lead agency to manage the other 2 and coordinate. And in that case, they're probably going to want a little extra money for that. So it really kind of depends on how ambitious you are in your outreach. What press outlets are important for you? Is there unique beats or outlets that maybe are more elusive? If you absolutely want a story in the Wall Street Journal, that is a lot harder to achieve than, getting coverage maybe with IGN or PC Gamer or, another Eurogamer or something like that. What are your expected results? If you're expecting, for example, to drive 50,000 wish list additions, first of all, you should not be using PR to drive sales, but invariably, most people do make that calculus and that math, even though that's not the purpose. But think about what your outcome will be. Like if you spend a certain amount of money and at the end of the campaign, you ask yourself, was it worth it? Figure out what is that criteria of success, where you can go back to the PR agency or your PR staff and say, hey, good job. You did a good job on PR given the expense that was involved in the effort. Are there other agencies involved? I've already talked about that. Is your story difficult to communicate? The more difficult something is, typically the more it costs. What time of year are you launching? If you're trying to do PR right now, it is very, very difficult. Election cycle in the US, new consoles come out next week, but all the media already has them right now. All the AAA, release titles are out there. If you can avoid fourth quarter unless you have a AAA title, I strongly recommend that you avoid it. That means, publish before October 1. Definitely no later than the end of October. November is extremely difficult pretty much every year. December can be actually easier toward the middle, but the window to the holidays is so short, I don't recommend it. If you can publish in January without consequences to your stakeholders or whatever, much better window of time, and it's less expensive to buy marketing. Sponsors, influencers are less expensive. PR is easier to do. It all translates into saving time and money and getting better results probably. Are you thinking about press tours, events, trade shows? That all costs extra. Are influencers a key focus? Okay, then you're only going to get so far with organic, unpaid influencers. So you may need to think about a sponsored or paid influencer campaign. Again, that costs extra. Are you spending, or do you have somebody in-house that can do this? Are you working with a single freelancer or a very small studio, or are you working with a full-blown PR agency? And I'm going to come to the pros and cons to all of those, but all of those typically have different price tags. And, at the end of the day, the game's quality and the expected market performance. If you expect to sell 200,000 units of something, hopefully you did everything right. Hopefully the game quality is amazing. You've done lots of marketing, and then you also have a great PR effort. The main thing here for PR, though, it is much easier to get good PR results with a great game than a difficult one. And, that's just, very obvious, but people sometimes forget that, especially, when the, please don't call my baby ugly syndrome kicks in, because you've been working on this game. You expect everybody else to love the game, but if there's a lot of bugs or other things that are just not up to par, you're just not going to have great results. So it's better to, and a good partner will tell you kind of, when you should just, adjust your expectations a little bit so you're not totally disappointed when you have a pretty good result, but not an amazing result. Okay. At the end of the day, PR costs, a wide range. You can get packages from, freelancers probably do it for $1,000 or $2,000 a month, all the way up. We have clients that we charge $20,000 a month. Most of the PR work is typically, I would say, somewhere between, in gaming, between about $3,000 to about $7,500 a month. That's for a U.S. agency. Different agencies, of course, have different prices, depends on territories and things, but that's a pretty good range if you were to sit down and do a market plan and say, I need to allocate some PR dollars for that. And that, with that being said, we have some special packages that we've made available for members of the Brazilian Games Association as well, that are a little bit turnkey, but they give you a pretty significant savings and put you at the very bottom of that price range. So something we can talk about as well if anybody is interested. All right, that's enough of the selling on that one. So let's talk a little about, do you do it yourself or should you hire somebody to do PR? So, if you do your own, if you have a team member with the skills, it doesn't cost you anything extra. You're not paying an agency or freelancer. You own the press contact info. So if you're making one game and then you make your next one, you already have something to build on. You keep all those contacts, you own those communications, you have full transparency. You can approve messaging and other things much quicker in-house because you're going to walk over to somebody's desk, or if you're working remotely, coworkers typically can get stuff done quicker and be more flexible than if you have an external agency that may be in a different time zone than you are. Again, this goes back to greater flexibility in terms of your timeline. We've had, a couple situations where we're working with a client in a certain territory. They want a press release out at 5 a.m. for some reason. We get it all approved. We agree everything is final. We set it up the night before to go out that morning, or we work with an outlet for an exclusive. And then at 4:30 in the morning, our time, they suddenly try to email us and say, hey, stop, we had something come up. Unless somebody has insomnia and happens to be checking, that thing has sailed. Whereas if you have somebody inside your company, you may have more flexibility to say, hey, we're delaying the project last minute. Don't worry about it. It's not to be underrated. It does, if you're not really good at planning and you have those crisis moments happen frequently, it wouldn't hurt maybe to have somebody in-house that can manage that for you. And then your internal staff is always going to know your game or your product than an outsider. And then, scheduling meetings, for example, for interviews and things like that is just easier because you can just look at somebody's calendar directly, or, again, they're more accessible to you typically. Downsides, you've got to find your own press contacts, and they change all the time. You've got to rely on just one individual typically, then a full team. And, I have 12 people on my team. There's been so many times where, one person had some unique expertise or contacted an outlet that, even me doing it for 20 plus years hasn't had. So the more people you have on your PR team, the better your results will be, or the easier it will be to get great results. Again, that's point kind of relates to that one. And you have to weigh, salary and benefits versus somebody you can just pay for a project and then be done. When you're done shipping the game and you've wrapped it up, you don't have to pay for your PR anymore unless you're working on something else. And it is a lot more work than most people think. If you're going to do it well, it really is pretty much a full-time job. Okay, and this slide is usually the end of my presentation, so I'll do a quick time check with you guys, but I just want to run this through. When you're talking to a PR agency, and I recommend you talk to multiple and compare and see which one feels right for you. The first question you should ask yourself is, can you see yourself working collaboratively with them? We work very collaboratively. We talk to our clients all the time. If you and everybody's needs and personalities are different agencies are better for different people. Make sure you like the people that, you met and that are going to be on your account, and that you get a sense that, hey, it'll be fun working with them. We're going to get along, because it is important, especially when things get tense or something gets screwed up or whatever. It's important to be on the same team and not fight each other. Does the agency have demonstrated expertise in a project somewhat alike to yours? I think that's important. For example, I wouldn't hire a mainstream PR agency to do games PR. I also wouldn't suggest that you hire a gaming PR agency maybe to do mainstream PR or financial PR. That is not our forte. We touch those areas, but that's just not what we're best at. When you're talking with them, are they asking you the right questions during the initial meetings? Do they care about you? Do they care about your challenges? Or do they just tell you about their agency and how great they are? To me, that matters. Do they understand or seem to your brand? And are they providing solutions to your challenges? You can see that in a proposal. You can see that in a discovery call. If they're not talking the same language, or don't get what you're trying to do, or don't seem to have solutions that sound right to you, that should be a red flag. Do they have a demonstrable positive relationships with the media? And, you can look at our website as an example. We highlight positive coverage we've done. We promote stuff on our social media. We put it on LinkedIn. But, if somebody looks like they've never talked to the press, or you're not seeing any recent press coverage that they've orchestrated, probably not the best place to hang your brand on. They have creative ideas, and they seem enthusiastic about your product. This is, maybe not for everybody. For me, I think it's super important that I believe in selling and in PR. If you're not enthusiastic about something, you're not going to do a great job. And so it's an important aspect for me to have a good match. So for example, with our team, I ask the team, we obviously look at bandwidth and availability, but I also say, hey, who liked that product? Who was excited about that game? Who wants that? And usually we have 2 or 3 people that's their favorite genre or type of game, and they sort of, make them hand wrestle or arm wrestle to see who gets to lead the project. But we want to make sure that people that are excited about the type of product that you're bringing and want to work on it, not just because you're paying them, but because they genuinely are excited about what the product offers. And in gaming specifically, I think it matters whether they actually play games, whether they know the space, whether they know competitive titles. And I also would look at, are they actively working with a direct competitor? And I want to clarify that, like with hardware is very competitive. Like PC gaming makers don't want you working on other PC gaming makers at the same time, usually because they're competing with each other. Gaming, it's a little bit less. Most indies support each other unless you have an exact, very similar game. Then I wouldn't recommend they should be working on it at the same time. But if they've previously worked on something like you and have had good results, that is invaluable because they've already learned a ton. They either have gotten a lot of expertise or have learned a lot of lessons of what works and doesn't work with something similar to what you're trying to get promoted. And so they have a huge head start on, somebody that has no experience with that particular type of genre or game or whatever. Okay. All right, let me just check over because I think we were right at about an hour and just wanted to see who's still here. Are we still good? I've got a few minutes to talk about just some case studies, or I can just jump to a Q&A, or I can sort of wrap it up at this point. It's, where are we at?
I think it would be nice if we could open for the Q&A, because it's an hour and 10, I think, maybe
Okay.
20 minutes for Q&A. Is that okay for everybody? You can talk. People from the audience. Are you ready for Q&A?
I am ready for Q&A. I'll skip through these, and you guys are all going to get the deck as well, so you can look at like our case study. Mostly what I wanted to do with the case studies was just to give you some ideas on how you can, sort of speak to the strength or what's going on maybe in topical things. Like we had one client where they created a emergency ventilator for COVID, and they're a PC maker, so it was a great opportunity to talk to the press, in March when, a lot of hospitals were getting overwhelmed and didn't have enough ventilators. It was a great story to talk about how they were repurposing and using like 50% of their facilities to make emergency ventilators and so forth. So sometimes things like that happen where you say, oh, that is something I can talk about to the media. Normally it might not be relevant, but right now it is. Let me think of a creative way to pitch this and get some additional coverage for it. So you guys can look over those. But otherwise, I jump into the Q&A, and I don't know if you guys can also type questions if you're shy. All right, so what do we have here? So is there a market in the US or other countries for games as puzzles and memory games for children or puzzles for adults? I would say there is. I think mobile probably heavily demonstrates or dominates that market. I always think of like Brain Age on the Nintendo DS, which was a fantastic game that I wish had come to other, platforms. So I do think it is a market. It is a niche market. It is tougher to do traditional PR for it. So thinking from a longer PR perspective, probably wouldn't recommend it. In fact, most mobile games, PR doesn't work as well just because there's just so many. So the barrier to entry is very low. But I do think, Lisa, you're, still actively getting, press releases. How many, puzzle and memory games for kids or adults are you seeing, and how are they performing? You're muted, sorry.
I forgot I was muted. Sorry, guys. They're pretty, it's pretty even-handed. It's not as frequent as I've seen them in the past. In terms of the kind of coverage that they're getting, pretty decent, especially if it's an extremely high-quality game or a really unique puzzle mechanic that hasn't been touched on before. Anything with really high-quality visuals or anything with really high-quality soundtrack or music is usually the ones that get the most coverage from the most diverse amount of outlets from what I've seen.
Yeah, and Switch titles too. Like, it depends on how puzzle. If it's very casual, like Connect 3 type of things, probably less so. And we do a few kind of, more casual games with Atari because they do a lot of like mobile or Switch titles, and they can get some coverage. But, on the Nintendo Switch, there's definitely some more elaborate puzzle games that are popular, that, do get. So I'd say there's a market. Just manage your expectations going into it.
Okay.
All right, so the next question is, do you have some tips to find journalist contact when the website doesn't have them on about section? The two ways that I usually look for them, and Lisa, you've certainly sleuthed out some editors too. Twitter is usually a good place. I'll do just a Google search to see what comes up and see if I can find them on Facebook or something else. Instagram, we're pretty ruthless about trying to find and potentially stalk them. I also use LinkedIn quite a bit, and LinkedIn, not only can you search by name, but you can also look for like employees of a certain outlet, and then go through those and see which one is. I haven't had a great amount of success pitching people on LinkedIn. It's more like I can find them. They just tend to not respond as much. But Twitter actually, especially if you can do DMs, has been pretty successful. And a lot of editors will also put their contact information, their email on their Twitter profile. And then I would say also, like Muckrack that we talked about, or, Meltwater or something, which again are paid services, that also sometimes, works. And I guess the question would be, why are you looking for a specific journalist or something? Like if you're trying to connect with somebody at a specific outlet, and you want to talk to one person directly, and if there's a general email address on the website, you can also sometimes reach out and just be asked to be connected to, that particular editor, if that's sort of the scenario.
Yeah, and sometimes editors, or at least outlets, will have YouTube channels, and they'll have some contact information in the email section. So that's another place you can look. Not as consistent as, say, Twitter or some of the other channels that Mario had mentioned, but that sometimes works.
Great. And any other questions? Is it possible for a small studio with 2 people working to get a good PR? I think so. And the reason I say that, going back to The Veil, I think is probably a good example. David started out with the founder of the studio with a pretty small studio on a small budget. I have worked with another studio called Infamous Quests, that do kind of retro classic 2D point and click adventures like, King's Quest type of games. I previously worked with a company called Phoenix, I think Phoenix Interactive, that did a bunch of again, adventure games mostly, and narrative-driven games like Gabriel. They did a Gabriel Knight sequel that was probably their biggest one, but they also had a lot of other ones that were 1 or 2 developers making the game. So it all comes down to not really how big your team is, but how good the quality of the game is, and how creative and different. That can take you a long, long way. Back to my earlier point where if you make a good game, it is so much easier to PR. And also, if you're very clear about what makes your game unique and it can explain that easily, that is the hook that editors are looking for. Because again, you're trying to cut through the literally hundreds of pitches that they get every single day. And so having a clear concept, good visuals, and something they can jump in and play, and it's different, so it gives them an interesting story to talk about. Certainly there's no reason why a small team couldn't get good PR. Biggest challenge I think we usually have for small teams is funding, because it does cost some PR, but if you're willing to do sort of the legwork yourself, that goes away a little bit. But yeah, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to get good PR as well.
Yeah, and sometimes editors really like 1 or 2 person team story. Like, look at the success of Stardew Valley. That was one guy who made the whole game, and it blew up. So if your game is super quality, has a lot of really cool, unique features to it, and on top of that, it's come from a very small studio, editors love that story. So totally possible.
Yeah, I was just trying to look up, back to, the question about puzzle games. Somebody else had asked, what's more popular, adult or kids. It sort of depends on the definition of a puzzle game. There's some very elaborate puzzle games, in a way, something like a Limbo or something could be conceived as a puzzle game. I played several puzzle games on the PlayStation, on the Nintendo Switch certainly has them. So I don't know that there's there's a bigger market. If I had to pick between the 2, I would probably almost skew it a little bit more adult. you know, there used to be sort of the stereotype about like casual and puzzle and stuff were more, you know, perhaps female oriented or whatever, but I don't even know that that's true anymore. I think a good game, you know, it's like, you know, my girlfriend is an example of that, you know, like not that Animal Crossing necessarily is a, you know, a puzzle game. It's more of a kind of a social gather collect kind of game. But she usually does like very casual Connect 3 games, and Animal Crossing completely sucked her in where she was playing that. So it transcends audiences. A good game is a good game. But if I had to answer, I'd probably skew a little bit more teenager and older. At least I don't know if you agree or disagree with that.
I would say puzzle games that can span for both. So it's, you know, got a lot of features that adults would enjoy in terms of like, you know, like I was mentioning before, high quality visuals, interesting soundtrack, really unique factors and little nods to things that adults would understand, but can still be accessible for kids in terms of like, don't worry about complexity because kids love to learn as long as your, you know, your difficulty curve doesn't like suddenly spike. If there's like a gradual progression to it and they can learn it, as spanning both is usually the ideal niche for a puzzle style game.
And I mean, if it's like cooperative or collaborative, I was just actually, as you were saying that, Lisa, total point, I was playing a couple games. My grandson is just turned 4, so you know he can't read yet, and you know so he's limited in what he can do, but he loves playing games with me. And so if we can play something together, even if he doesn't fully know what he's doing, it spans both of us, and it's something that we can do together. So it sort of depends. And you also need to think about the platform. You know, I don't know how many younger kids have Nintendo Switches already, or whether you know there's a certain cutoff where you have more of that or other console versus a mobile game, or maybe like, you know, if you're publishing it on like on Fire TV, you know, Fire device, Fire tablet, or an iPad. That also, I think, kind of matters as to in terms of what the, you know, predominant audience is going to be there. All right. So I'll move this up here, and if anybody has any questions, even if you want to unmute yourself and ask, feel free. Don't be shy. Do you think that organic growth in social networks is a challenge, even though the game is good? So you're talking about growing your social media channels for games, and I would say absolutely. I mean, social media growth, I think, is a challenge for everybody. I think if you have a certain critical mass, it's easier. So for example, we run the social media channels for Atari and all of their various games. And even there, we notice, you know, the bigger accounts that have huge followings already, there is already that built-in audience. But, you know, when you look at things like Facebook and the algorithms, and unless you pay, you're only reaching a fraction, you are on somebody else's platform, and they are incentivized to monetize that audience. You don't really own that audience. So yeah, it is challenging. I think you can overcome a lot of it with good community management and social media discipline and regular high quality engaging content. But it's not, you know, it is not easy, and it should only be one part. Like, you shouldn't rely on that. That's why I say, like, you know, put up your own Discord server, you know, where you can actually interact on your terms, build that audience. That audience can follow you from game to game. Think of it as an investment, you know, especially if you're into game development for a longer time or publishing. You know, think about the audience you're building today, that they also, you know, could potentially be your audience for the future, and then your sales job is much easier, you know, to get them. So, but yeah, it's organic without spending any paid is. You know, is tough and gets tougher. And even with advertising, even getting advertised to execute well is difficult these days because the rules change all the time. And you literally have, you know, not only any support that you can get to, nor any real voice, because, you know, it's a minor, you know, you're a minor sliver to them, unfortunately. And so that's bad. I don't want to say don't invest in growing your social media channels, but manage expectations. I feel like that's my mantra through life.
Yeah, it's definitely a slow and steady climb, and requires a lot of constant monitoring and engagement. So definitely engage your audience, because that will help that growth. But it's, as Mario had mentioned, it's a very slow, steady climb.
Yeah, that's actually, I mean, that's a great point that you're making there. Actually, I wasn't thinking about it, but it's not just about posting content. Like even some large companies that we've worked with, all they do is like one way, just blah, 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 talk about me, talk about us, talk about our games. And, you know, good social media is not just talking about you and your game. It's talking about topics that you think followers of your accounts would like, you know, maybe a 60-40 split, you know, so if you can talk about other things happening in the industry, or, you know, what you had for lunch that day, or what's going on with your team, or what your, you know, brag wall at your office looks like, or something else that you can really truly, like, you're trying to build friendships. You're not just trying to acquire customers, you're building friendships, and talk to them. You know, if somebody DMs you or says something, respond to them. That is part of the, you know, the requirement for social media, you know, and there's still those companies that just put out the stuff like it's yet another channel. That's one way that they just talk about themselves, like a megaphone. And that is not what social media is, or how social media really, you know, you can do it, that's fine, but you're not going to see the kind of growth or long-term community that you really want. Awesome. Okay. Well, if no one else has any questions, I did put our last slide on there. Thank you. And that's why I said the spin doctor comment early on. You know, I don't want to say I'm a professional liar. So, when I used to go to Nintendo, being named Mario, they would always look at me like, "Are you really Mario?" And my joke to them would be, "Yeah, I'm here to pick up my royalties." So, still waiting on those, but. So anyway, you guys have my contact information. Eliana has our contact information. I think Lisa's going to follow up and send the deck out to everybody that attended. If any of you guys want to have conversations, you know, you just need some help, you need some advice, happy to do it. If any of you are working on a project where you think you might need some PR help, we would be happy to have a discovery call and find out what's going on and what we can do. Again, we are a resource for you, you know, through Abra Games and Brazil Games, and you know, we just really thank it. And if any of you are you know, in this webinar, that we've had the fortune and the pleasure of helping talk about your game and your company over the last year, or met you at the one trade show, I guess, that we got to do before everything sort of ended. I just want to thank you all very much from the bottom of our heart. It has been a really pleasure to work with Brazil and Brazil Games for the whole year. You know, we hope we do it for many, many more years, and hopefully we get to work with many more of you directly.
Likewise. Thank you very much. It was a great partnership. We really got along and got excellent results. So thank you very much. And we'll keep talking. Thank you.
Sounds like a plan. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye-bye.